Before dawn on a spring morning in 1927, a farmer standing on the Mississippi River levee near Greenville, Mississippi, felt the earth tremble beneath his boots. The river had risen for weeks, swallowing fields, roads, and entire towns with a patience that felt deliberate. Now it pressed against the man-made wall with a force that seemed almost thoughtful, as if the water were considering its next move. When the levee finally failed, it did not explode. It sighed, opened, and allowed the river to reclaim what it believed had always been its own. This is a true story. It is the story of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, an event so vast that it changed the geography of the United States, reshaped American politics, transformed civil rights, redefined the federal government's responsibility to its citizens, and quietly altered the cultural soul of the nation. It is a story of engineering arrogance and human resilience, of racial injustice exposed by disaster, of music carried by water, and of a river that refused to be controlled. The Mississippi River had always been both a promise and a threat. For centuries before Europeans arrived, indigenous nations understood its rhythms. They farmed its floodplains, traveled its currents, and respected its seasonal violence. The river flooded, yes, but it also renewed the soil. Flooding was not a failure, it was a cycle. That understanding would be lost as America grew obsessed with permanence. By the late 19th century, the United States had committed itself to a singular vision. The river must be tamed. Levees would hold it in place. Channels would be straightened. Floodwaters would be forced to obey lines drawn on maps. Engineers believed that with enough earth, concrete, and confidence, nature could be disciplined. The slogan was simple and seductive: the levees only policy. Build them higher, stronger, longer, and the river would submit. It did not. The winter of 1926-1927 was unusually wet across the Mississippi River basin. From Pennsylvania to Montana, storms rolled in with relentless precision. Snow piled high in the Rockies and Appalachians. Rain soaked the Ohio Valley. When spring arrived early and warm, the snow melted quickly, feeding tributaries already swollen with rain. By April 1927, the Mississippi and its feeder rivers were carrying more water than anyone alive had ever seen. In Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio meets the Mississippi, residents watched the water creep up staircases and swallow streets. Barges broke loose and drifted like toys. Entire sections of riverbanks simply disappeared. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers insisted the levees would hold. They had to. The entire system depended on belief. In Greenville, Mississippi, white planters gathered on the levee with binoculars and measuring sticks, tracking the water's rise in inches that felt like hours. Behind them, tens of thousands of black sharecroppers, men, women, children, waited anxiously. They had been ordered to stay. Armed guards prevented them from leaving. The logic was brutally simple. If the levees failed, someone would be needed to repair them, and if evacuation meant lost labor, that was considered unacceptable. When the levee broke at Mound's Landing on April 21, 1927, the water did not merely flood the delta, it erased it. A wall of water poured through the gap, spreading outward across Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. In some places, the flood was 60 miles wide. Entire towns vanished beneath brown, churning water. Houses floated away intact, carrying furniture, photographs, and sleeping animals. Trains sat stranded on islands of track. Trees snapped and spun like matchsticks. By the time the river receded months later, more than 27,000 square miles had been flooded, an area larger than several U.S. states combined. Nearly 1 million people were displaced. Hundreds died, though the true number was never known. Livestock losses were catastrophic. Crops were destroyed on a scale that defied accounting. But the numbers only hint at the human experience. Families climbed onto rooftops and waited for days, waving sheets at passing boats. Some survived by tying themselves to trees. Others drowned within sight of safety. The flood did not discriminate in its physics, but the response to it did. In the chaos, race became a matter of life and death. African Americans bore the brunt of the suffering. In the Deep South, African American refugees were herded into camps along the levees, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly. Forced labor continued even after the floodwaters arrived, with men compelled to work on levee repairs at gunpoint. White refugees, by contrast, were more often evacuated, transported by train or boat to safer ground. The Red Cross, tasked with relief, became entangled in the racial politics of the region. While many individuals acted heroically, the system itself reflected the segregation of the era. One Red Cross official later admitted that relief distribution was shaped by the demands of plantation owners, who feared losing their labor force more than they feared the flood. News of the disaster spread nationwide through newspapers and radio. Americans read stories of towns submerged, of babies born on rooftops, of bodies tangled in treetops weeks later. Photographs showed endless water broken only by church steeples and telephone poles. President Clive Collins remained largely silent. Instead, the federal response was delegated to the Secretary of Commerce, a quiet, methodical engineer named Herbert Hoover. Hoover had already built a reputation as a humanitarian for his work organizing food relief during World War I. Now he was given the most complex domestic crisis the nation had ever faced. Hoover approached the flood like an engineering problem, but also like a public relations campaign. He coordinated relief efforts across multiple states, mobilized the Red Cross, and ensured that newspapers carried images of him inspecting camps and speaking with refugees. He insisted that the federal government was merely coordinating private charity, not expanding its authority. But in practice, the response marked a turning point. Washington was now deeply involved in disaster relief on a massive scale. The flood camps themselves became strange, temporary cities. In places like Greenville and Vicksburg, tents stretched for miles. Loudspeakers announced food distributions. Doctors treated illnesses caused by contaminated water. Musicians played to lift spirits. It was in these camps that a sound traveled north. Blues musicians, many displaced by the flood, sang about loss, water, and wandering. One song in particular would echo across decades, "When the Levee Breaks," first recorded by Kansas Joe McCoy and Memphis Minnie in 1929. It captured the terror and inevitability of the flood in haunting lines that would later be reinterpreted by artists like Led Zeppelin. The music carried the emotional truth of the disaster farther than any report. As the waters finally receded in late summer, the scale of the devastation became undeniable. Entire communities chose not to rebuild. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the South permanently, accelerating the Great Migration to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. They carried memories of betrayal, of being trapped, forced to labor, denied aid. Those memories would shape Black political consciousness for generations. The flood also destroyed the illusion of absolute control over the river. Congress launched investigations. Engineers debated fiercely. The levees-only policy was quietly abandoned. In its place emerged a new philosophy. The river must be given room to flood. Spillways, floodways, and controlled outlets that could divert water away from cities. The Flood Control Act of 1928 committed the federal government to the largest civil engineering project in American history. billions of dollars would be spent reshaping the Mississippi Basin. The Army Corps of Engineers gained unprecedented power. The river was not tamed, but it was negotiated with. Herbert Hoover rode the wave of his flood response straight to the presidency in 1928. He promised efficiency, compassion, and modern management. Few voters knew about the darker realities of the flood camps. Fewer still questioned the cost. But the river had one more lesson to teach. In New Orleans, during the height of the flood, local elites feared that New Orleans would be inundated if upstream levees failed. A decision was made, quietly, controversially, to dynamite a levee south of the city, deliberately flooding rural parishes to relieve pressure. The explosion sent water rushing into communities that had been promised safety. Homes were destroyed,